In speaking about Black American disadvantage and its implications for American democracy, I draw on my many years of study as an economic theorist and public intellectual. First, I offer two statements of principle. Persistent Black disadvantage is an American tragedy. It is a national, not merely a communal disgrace. Secondly, where inequality is a problem, let us address it forthrightly. But let us do so on behalf of a program of human decency, not of racial equity.
All right. Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robertson. I am the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. My guest today is the distinguished professor of economics, Glenn Loury. Professor Lowry has a long career as a commentator on economics, on race, on sociology. He was the first Black tenured professor in the Harvard economics department in his early 30s. He is the man who coined the term social capital, and he has produced a number of fascinating, controversial, provocative works that we're going to dive into. He has just reissued his book, The Anatomy of Racial Inequality. This is the second edition with a new preface out from Harvard University Press. Professor Lowry, thank you so much for joining me.
You're welcome, Nathan. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you for the introduction.
So, the anatomy of racial inequality is where I'd like to start. So this book is an attempt to do a few things. You originally published it back in 2002. You're bringing it back out now. I think it's I really think it's a totally fascinating book because because economists, I'm a sociology PhD student, and economists generally don't take much interest in sociology, but I feel like this book shows what kind of the way in which the work of economists can be kind of enriched by sociology, and I don't think many people are doing this, and it's really quite cool just from an academic perspective. But I want to get to the core, the key theory of the book. So what you're attempting to do is basically, as I understand it, clarify some of our thinking about what race is, what racism and discrimination are, whether those terms are the terms we should use, and understand how racial inequalities develop. And you start by basically, one of the interesting things to me is that, you are kind of associated with conservatism, but it seems like you differ from a lot of others on the right. And in fact, I think you've said that you've broken from some on the right in that you reject very strongly in this book race blindness. And in particular, you say that the fact that there is no biological racial essentialism that leads some people to say, well, race is a figment, we should just ignore it, does not mean that race is less real. So perhaps you could draw out the distinction between yourself and some others who say, well, race is a social construct, so we can just ignore it and move past it.
So what is race? So I'm saying basically you've got marks on human bodies that people are taking to be significant. They don't have to be intrinsically significant. The meaning can emerge out of the way in which people associate their expectations. And, I have the concept of stereotyping. I have the concept of stigma. But it's a socially constructed and not a biological conception of race.
Mm-hmm. Is it fair to also analogize to a situation in which if you had a hypothetical society in which everyone was given a label, 1 or 2 or A or B, and then they sort of started to attach meaning to these labels, identities developed around these labels, the people labeled number 1 started developing conceptions about the people labeled number 2. These categories would become very, very salient in explaining the society, how it worked. They'd be salient in understanding people's identity and the way they perceived each other. But there'd be no, it could just be a random assignment even. It could be totally arbitrary. Is that kind of what you mean by socially constructed?
Yeah, that is what I mean. And once these associations come into being, especially once these identifications come into being, they become facts in and of themselves. So to say that a person is irrational to, for example, give meaning or invest identity in their racial coloration, because after all, this is all very arbitrary and there are no intrinsic differences between people based on that. We've only freighted on these meanings on top of it. To say that it's irrational is a mistake. I mean, if in fact you anticipate that other people are going to interact with you in a particular way, or if the way in which you understand your history and kind of reduce its total complexity to a meaningful narrative for yourself is built around these superficial traits, that becomes these become facts in and of themselves. The meanings are facts, even if the framework on which those meanings are hanging is in some sense arbitrary.
One of the most fascinating parts of your book to me was when you talked about what you call self-confirming stereotypes. That is, when meanings or prejudices are attached based on racial categories, and then the stereotypes become true through having been assigned. And one the example that stuck with me is you talk about the cab driver who assumes that young black men at night are going to be criminals, are going to be robbers, and you point out that even if the rate of offending among young black men is actually no higher, through the cab driver's decisions, it may be that because we start off with cab drivers in 1952 and they're prejudiced, right? And it's a result of prejudice. And then, as a result, young black men who aren't robbers think, well, I can't get a cab, so I'm gonna find some other form of transit. Then you say ultimately, then it will turn out that because of a selection effect, the cab driver will be correct that out of the percentage of young black men who would get in his cab that night, there is a disproportionate number of people who would want to rob him, even though the rates of offending are no different. And so the prejudice has made the thing true. Is that a correct description of the?
Oh, that's brilliant. That's just absolutely perfect. It was exactly what's going on. And the whole thing is that the cab driver is able to make different assumptions about whether he'll be robbed based on race, only because he can see the race. It's this marker that the cab driver can see. But in the example is meant to capture exactly what you said, which is this idea that there could be no difference in the background condition between these populations, but the equilibrium pattern could be very unequal and could be justifiably a source of generalized suspicion or differential behavior. The cab driver is not the wrong actor. He's not making a mistake in the example that you described. He correctly anticipates he's more likely to be robbed by the black guy, but the only black guys who are hailing cabs disproportionately are robbers because the non-robbing black guys know that the cab's not going to stop for them. So why are they out there? But the robbing black guys will be willing to wait all day in order to get somebody to stop. So that's not real inequality in the endowments of the populations, but it is equilibrium inequality because the cab driver can differentiate his behavior based upon race. Race has been made meaningful in this context, but it doesn't have an intrinsic meaning. And that was one of the things that I wanted to try to get across in the book. And I wanted to ask people to reflect on whether, if indeed this kind of phenomenon can be happening, it would be understood to be happening. That is, would an observer be prepared to consider that the apparent inequality was really an artifact and not a deep or essentialist feature of the two groups? I'm talking about racial inequality, the anatomy of racial inequality. So, I'm trying to build a ground in which the inequality need not be an indictment of the population that's on the short end.
Could you discuss one of the core distinctions that you make in the book, which is between the language of discrimination and racism and the language that you prefer in this book, which is what you call biased social cognition and stigma, which you emphasize are sort of more clarifying in thinking about what is actually going on to create contemporary racial inequality?
So, okay, I mean, I'm. It's a long story, Nathan. Actually, I mean, I'm trying to say the social meanings that attach to particular racial markers. So I'm saying blackness. So blackness is stigmatizing in the American context because it's associated with the people who descend from slaves. You can't have that kind of an institution without that is racial in its construction, without it tainting the connotations and associations that are brought to mind by the racial markers. So this is stigma, and I'm trying to. The political question is, what explanations do people give to account for the disparities that they're seeing? So if they think they're within the systemic interactions and therefore subject to the possibility of change, that would be one thing. But if they think that they are a reflection of the sort of intrinsic nature of the different groups, then they will be less inclined to affirm, to take social responsibility. I mean, take incarceration, for example, where there's a huge racial disparity. Um, is that a reflection of the systemic interaction between people in the society, or is it a reflection of the nature of the racially identified group, of their culture, even of their genes? So that's what I think is at stake in the debate about the anatomy of racial inequality.
Okay, I want to dive into this incarceration thing because I think this is a really fascinating area in which I sense. Okay, here's what I sense in reading your writing, which is always fascinating to me, is that there are multiple they're not multiple Glenn Lourys, but there's a tension, I feel, in your work between a lot of the time I see you emphasizing factors that are intrinsic. That you had this this tweet recently where you're like, stop emphasizing black victimhood in your testimony that you gave to the Senate Banking Commission. This is I really want to try and reconcile two things here, because when you were talking in this testimony about incarceration and racial inequality, I mean, you said that those who blame systemic racism for mass incarceration, they hire a number of black people in jail, and you say those who say that that's self-evidently a sign of racial antipathy. When you respond, no, it's mainly a sign of antisocial behavior by criminals who happen to be black. People will dismiss you as a moral reprobate. But you say that people are not being arrested, convicted, and sentenced because of their race. Those in prison are, in the main, those who have broken the law. Seeing prisons as a racist conspiracy to confine black people is an absurd proposition. No serious person could believe it. That's from the testimony, okay? And then I go back to the structure of racial inequality. And when you're talking about mass incarceration in that book, you say that I see stigma, the non-attribution of a common humanity, at the core of the problem of the treatment. This is of the treatment of criminals. And you say, but our public responses to a social malady say, drug involvement depend on the races of those suffering the problem. And that it's, and in the book, you argue, as I understand the argument you make in the book, it's that there may be differences in rates of criminal offending, but that what is driving our responses to those, and the reason that race is still a salient factor in explaining mass incarceration, is that you talk heavily about this difference in the degree to which people are granted a common humanity. And you say these, quote, these cognitive distinctions tend to be drawn to the detriment of millions of racially stigmatized citizens. And that's why, instead of treating youthful suburban, the way youthful suburban dwelling drug buyers would get a therapeutic response, city dwelling drug sellers elicit a punitive response. And so I want to ask you to kind of try to reconcile these perspectives, where on the one hand you say, well, we can't talk about race is not the problem with mass incarceration. It's law breaking. We need to look at culture. And then on the other hand, you say, but also we put people in prison because we disregard their common humanity, and stigma affects the worth that we assign people, and that's based on race.
Again, that's very brilliant, Nathan. I think you summarized the lay of the land, and I'm not even sure I can reconcile the things. I mean, times change and the context in which you're operating changes. So you might be reacting, that is, I might be reacting to some degree to the nature of the larger conversation that's ongoing, and it becomes a matter of emphasis. But you're right to point to, I was very influenced, for example, by this book by Khalil Muhammad. He's the historian at Harvard at the Kennedy School. The book is called The Condemnation of Blackness. It's about race and criminal justice issues in the turn of the 20th century, America, 1890, 1900, 1910, 1920. And he's interested in pointing out how the stigma of race coming out of the post-bellum American reconciliation with, the incorporation of African Americans and that time in American political intellectual history, he's pointing out that the blacks were seen as different. European immigrants were coming in from the south and east of Europe in large numbers to eastern seaboard American cities. And they also had various social behavioral issues and criminality and whatnot, but their criminality was taken to be specific to their social location, whereas the blacks' criminality was somehow seen as intrinsic in some way. The Condemnation of Blackness. This is Khalil Muhammad. I was very taken by that book. Very taken by the kind of social psychological etiology of the war on drugs and the condemnation of drug addiction and whatnot, and the way in which racial tropes and racial stereotypes play into that. And I don't disavow this idea that the catastrophe of mass mobilized incarceration for low-income Black communities didn't register in the same degree within the social political consciousness as it might have done because of the stigmatizing social meanings of Blackness. But I'm taken by another idea. And I mean, if this doesn't square the circle of my apparent contending views, I think it might help.
Okay.
First of all, notice all of what I said had to do not so much with the administration of law, but with the kind of larger political framing of, in which the legal thing, it wasn't about police singling out Black people for law enforcement. It was about whether or not you really wanted to have as punitive a response to the fact of illicit drug trafficking as you elected to have. The idea that there would be a conspiracy, that is to say, the idea that discrimination is the issue, that it's the police unfairness that is the question, that it's somehow white supremacy that is stalking us, when in fact I have a homicide rate that's off the charts, I have carjackings, et cetera, et cetera. I have the fact of the criminal behavior. It doesn't follow from the fact that there are deep social causation to a ghetto community where lawlessness is widespread. It doesn't follow from the fact that that is a social product that no responsibility falls on the individual actors who are in fact killing each other, mugging and robbing and raping people. To talk about crime is not to take a stand against the quest for social justice. This seems a category mistake to me, to preclude a fervent defense of the innocent victims of criminal activity, to preclude it on the argument that big social forces are at work here. Don't I understand? Take a stand within that political. I mean, again, I think it's a category mistake.
Yeah, but I feel like one of the reasons that people on the left, and again, this is sort of identified in the conclusion to your book, where I think you helpfully categorize three different possible explanations of racial inequality. You say you describe external structures to the group, that is civic and public institutions that provide opportunities and rewards, schools, policing, the rules governing market transactions, etc. Then you describe non-external factors, that is those internal cultural things are influenced by an internal group culture mediating between subjects and opportunities. And then you describe a third explanation, which is racial essentialism, which is kind of the Charles Murray view, which says that essentially race is real and it's a biological fact, and there are things that are intrinsic to Black people that are not even cultural, that are the cause of these things. And one of the points, and one of the points that you make is that racial essentialism essentially allows you to have a kind of excuse for not doing anything. And you emphasize both in the book and in your testimony that it is the responsibility of Americans to see racial inequality as a problem that we all care about. And I think one of the issues seems to be that when people hear explanation, you talk about explanation number 2, which is these what you call non-external structures. They hear explanation number 3. And so they hear the attribution of internal defects to African Americans. And obviously people react very, very viscerally and quite rightly to what amounts to an essentialist kind of racism. I feel like that partially explains why these conversations are so emotional.
That's, again, very, very fine set up in characterizing this. The 3 different possible explanations: external forces of oppression, internal lack of coordination and development of the cultural nexus to support success, or there's something wrong with these people. And it hems in the discourse, the fear that you might give credit to the essentialists, and the injury that any entertainment of the idea that Black people are somehow inferior or unfit, or somehow in their nature not able to accommodate the modern world. I mean, there's the threat to the psyche, to the sense of value. So yes, that's all true. And I'm an internal man, and I've had a conversation with Charles Murray at my podcast, actually, about his book, Facing Reality, but we got into some of the other stuff. And I didn't condemn him as vociferously as I think some of my listeners would have wanted me to do. I had a civil conversation with him, a respectful conversation. But I wanted to highlight this distinction between, there's nothing wrong with Black people that we can't fix, which is the internal. I'm acknowledging that there might be something wrong with Black people. That's already saying quite a bit. I'm acknowledging that the out of wedlock birth rate. I'm acknowledging that the intellectual achievement gap. I'm acknowledging that the overrepresentation amongst the criminal offending I'm acknowledging that the dysfunction that we see manifest in one way or another is a real quote unquote problem with Black people. That's already a huge step, because most would have it, many, that it's entirely external, that there's no space for any consideration of this thing that I'm talking about when I talk about the internal and the cultural. So to be able to have that conversation while at the same time being mindful of the essentialists out there who would want to use the confession of dysfunction as evidence of intrinsic unfitness is a difficult thing to do, but we must have the conversation.
I think one of the problem, I mean, when I read, so I thought this, I was totally fascinated by the book, and then I was totally angered by the Senate testimony, right? Because I found that it felt to me like the book was so beautifully nuanced, and then in some of the stuff that you write, and I hear you say, when you say now, you're an internal man. Well, I understand it from one perspective, because I'm not Black, and I think it would be very different if I was Black and I was talking to other Black people about. I just think the conversation is different, right? Because you can, if I was, if you're telling a child, if you're telling a Black child the story of what they can do, right? You tell them a different story you don't tell them that you can't accomplish anything, you get all these barriers in your way. You tell a kind of almost a conservative story about fulfilling your dreams, because otherwise you have a self-fulfilling prophecy where you demoralize a child, and then the barriers do become real. But when you're talking to the Senate Banking Commission, I feel like there's all this stuff in your book that I think is so important, that you give in your testimony. You're rejecting an account of systemic racism. You're saying, systemic racism, but your book seems to be an account of a more of an intelligent way to understand how systemic racism is in fact very important, and how the legacy of history, how things that happen over the course of generations are really, really difficult to purge, and why it is incredibly difficult for Black people internally to overcome these social cognitive biases, these inherited, you talk about the inheritance of these conceptions of dishonor, these conceptions of low worth. These are massive systemic factors that mean that that Black people in today's generation come into the United States with the institutions having people in them, people running institutions who do not see Black people as sharing in the equality of human worth. That seems to me to be an inescapable conclusion of what you say about stigma in the book. And the fact that then you emphasize, well, there's all these leftists who say it's systemic racism, but we need to look at ourselves, we need to look internally, seems to me to be much less nuanced than the very interesting account that you give in the book, where the internal culture is always at war against this giant inherited racial stigma.
Again, you're very wonderful in your summary observations here, and it's very stimulating. Look, I'm reissuing the book. I'm the same guy. I haven't disavowed the book. I say in the new preface, this is a better theory of systemic racism than the theories of systemic racism that you've heard. I'm proud of having a subtle and deep sociological sensibility, which I've honed over decades by reading, reading these sociologists. I mean, some of them were my friends. So, I mean, I'm not repudiating the nuance. I mean, it's going to sound like hackery, isn't it? It's going to look like, this is a hit piece somehow. I mean, so now I'm a flack, and that's not a good look. So I should probably try to defend myself here, Nathan. The fact that there is a deep stigma and anti-Blackness embedded within the DNA and the sinew and the consciousness and the Freudian subconscious and whatnot in this society is an unavoidable reality. Inveighing against it changes nothing. If the issue were, do I have a narrative that indicts white people and allows me to have an elaborate conversation, indeed a reckoning, within society about the fact of the durability of racial stigma? If that's what I were interested in doing, if I were just interested in lamenting the fact that this exists, but I'm talking about the quest for equality, and I'm saying this is the me who is no longer emphasizing the structural predicate, but rather insisting upon the existential imperative. Can I say that again, Nathan? I'm contrasting a sociological, almost Marxian-like causal account in some big structural forces way against how do you live? How do you actually get from one place to the other in life? How do you find dignity? Where do you find a meaningful expression of the fullness of your humanity? And we're talking about Black people. We're talking about 40 million people in the United States of America. And what I'm doing in shifting my emphasis from the subtle and nuanced and brilliant, if you will, dissection that I provide in that book to the contemporary emphasis, as was reflected in that banking committee, is I'm fighting for the existential dignity of my people. I'm sorry for how that sounds. I'm because we can go on forever lamenting what's the nobody is coming to save us, is what I'm saying, Nathan.
We sometimes hear, and I think we heard this morning, that the racial wealth gap is evidence of discrimination and structural racism. Is it your view that a racial wealth gap is ipso facto an indictment of our financial system?
I'm going to answer no, though I can understand some people answering yes here. The racial wealth gap is a legacy of history as well as a reflection of ongoing dynamics. I don't think, however, that broadly speaking, it should be understood as an indictment of the financial system, which is a complex set of institutions and relationships, which, as you noted in your opening remarks, is a necessary part of economic development and of growth.
Where I'm struggling with this tension between the book and the testimony is where you say this is the testimony. Common sense and much evidence suggests that on the whole, people are not being arrested, convicted, and sentenced because of their race, but because they've broken the law. But then the part on mass incarceration in the book is all about how that is technically true, but it is misleading because it avoids confronting the fact that the institutions that we've built to deal with crime are based on differential evaluations of people's social worth by their race. And that has resulted in a system where we don't mind the fact that millions of young Black men are essentially tossed in cages and given up on.
No, I'm sorry, I have to disagree with you. I don't think there's any inconsistency at all.
All right.
In saying on the one hand that the genesis and the organic evolution of the structures of order maintenance are tainted by racism and racial stigma and so on. To say that on the one hand, and to say on the other hand, most of the people under lock and key today are there because they raped somebody, robbed somebody, hurt somebody, and were duly processed and convicted. I say somewhere, not in this book, 1 million cases, each one rightly decided, can still add up to a historic wrong. It can be true at one and the same time that each one of the cases that resulted in a person being incarcerated was a faithful administration of judicial process, unbiased with respect to race. And it also be the case that the jails overflowing with young Black men in city after city around this country is a historical travesty. Those things are not inconsistent with each other. We have to decide, indeed, whether or not the summer of 2020, where cities were aflame, is going to happen again in 2022, when inevitably another incident in which a white police officer kills a black kid happens. We have to decide whether or not we're going to allow this vulnerability that we have to the mass mobilizations and to conflict to consume the democracy. That's not putting too fine a point on it, actually. And that's what I'm fighting over here about, Nathan.
Let me ask you this, though. I mean, I because I'm a man of the left, I tend to feel like I agree with what you said about how there isn't the two things you say can be reconciled, right? This is structure and agency in sociology, right? I mean, this is like individuals have agency, but they operate within broader social structures. But it's always seemed to me like people on the right, when Republicans ask you to come give testimony, they need to be educated on the structure, and the leftists need to get a better understanding of the agency. Right? Because when you're saying that, like, I feel like when you tell Republicans they don't have to care about structural racism, this is an empty term, it's an explainer of everything, that to me suggests that they don't have to confront what all of the stuff from the anatomy of racial inequality, which is these deep-seated, I mean, you don't use the term implicit bias, but that is another attempt to describe the kind of phenomenon you are talking about, which is that there are these deep inherited stigmas. And I feel like that's actually quite an important part of the story.
Yeah, I mean, my message, which is nobody is coming to save us. We must look African Americans reality in the face. We must accept responsibility for the way we raise our children and how we conduct ourselves, what we do with our time, for the nature of our family life, for the foundation of the development of our full reach of our human potential. This is what's not happening. So I'm beginning with a factual predicate. Like I say, the law could be fruit from a poison tree. I mean, it could be deeply, deeply, quote unquote, racist. But the law-breaking behavior.
Sure.
Okay. So
that makes sense to me to a black audience. To American conservatives and Republicans, when they hear that, they hear we don't have to care about police reform because it's all the fault of it's the fault of these dysfunctional communities. So we don't have to worry about the police.
The alternative would be to allow the way in which you reacted to the reality of in this case, in this example, law-breaking behavior, the way in which you reacted to it, to allow that to be driven by your anticipation of how addressing the factual circumstance will redound to their reaction. I mean, you're now hostage to this political bank shot that you're making.
But to dwell on the police example, right? I mean, the number of encounters with police among black people that are negative are reported as being very, very high compared to white people. I mean, even Roland Fryer's study saying that there's no racial bias in shooting suggested there is a lot of racial bias in the use of lower levels of force. Even people like Tim Scott and Jason Riley have said that, their encounters with police have been horrible, right? And so there is a need to build a public consensus among people who don't really care about reforming the police, that police don't treat black people well in very large swaths of this country. I mean, the Justice Department's reports on various police departments have really been horrifying. Like, there's a need for reform there. And people need to understand that, like, even if cops aren't intentionally hateful, they have this biased social cognition that results in, I don't know you don't like the term racism, but like racism.
I grant you that police need to be regulated in their behaviors. I grant you that there exists plenty of evidence that there is racial bias in the police behavior. It's a legendary feature of the thing. I'm not against reforms, sensible reforms. I don't want to defund police departments or abolish police departments, but those practical issues of the regulation of police need to be dealt with. But the narrative that there's an open season on Black people, that's Benjamin Crump's book, that's the title of the book, that America needs to take its knee off the neck of Black people, that's Al Sharpton at George Floyd's funeral in Houston. The narrative that the Blackness, we all have these anecdotes. I was stopped by a cop. The cop was rude. He assumed I had drugs in my trunk. He made me get out of my car. This has happened to me. I could tell this story. I'm not going to tell it. We don't have time for that. That this is a major phenomenon of justice in this society, such that the intensity of protest and violent demonstration against an order that's said to be repressive, I think it's hysteria, Nathan, frankly. I think it's a very interesting moral panic. It's a phenomenon of social psychology that should be studied. It's completely disconnected from reality. Because what we're doing here is we're arguing about the narrative. We're arguing about how the account is going to be told. And these things are of piece with one another. The critical race theory controversy in American schools about how you frame the teaching of race-related historical issues. The 1619 Project at the New York Times and contestation over how you represent the narrative. The diversity of training mania in corporate America and internal institutional contestations, which are about racial power within corporations and the comfort with which various employees feel in their work relations with one another, which then get politicized and assimilated to this larger narrative of racial reckoning. And I'll tell you what I think is at the root of it. The civil rights movement is 50-year-old history. The leverage to racial claims of unfairness, that the elasticity, as it were, on any social outcome that we could point to, de minimis. The big changes have already happened. The country is moving and it's moving on. And we're 50 years into the regime and people cling to it. No, I don't think the issue of police violence against Black people is a major first order or even a second order social phenomenon. I think it's a moral panic.
Does 50 years seem like a long time to you? It doesn't seem like a long time to me. That seems very, very brief to undo just hundreds of years of built up institutions and all the stigma you discuss in the book. These inherited conceptions, the structure of wealth in the country. That's like less than a human lifetime.
Okay, well, I'm saying the country has completely changed in these 50 years. There weren't any Asians to speak of within the American structure in 1965. America will not, in my opinion, in the mid-21st century, still be vulnerable to, we had slavery, we had Jim Crow, Black people were mistreated. We're an exception. African Americans are an exception. The country is going to process this however it's going to process it. The meaning of the American experiment is at stake. When you see a sitting member of Congress, Maxine Waters, make reference in the Border Patrol treatment of Haitian migrants to slavery, you see what I mean? That dog is not going to hunt, as they say in Texas. That's not going to
really. Wait, let me give a defensive one, because isn't the whole point again of the inherited dishonor and stigma, the stuff from Orlando Patterson that you discuss in the book, that the assessment of the worth of Black lives based on physical markers on the human anatomy is passed down generationally, so that the treatment of Haitians you would expect to have some link to history. You can link it to history.
No, I think that's wrong. I think it's quite wrong. I mean, you can link it. It's just you're just making a mistake. And I'm not disavowing anything that I've said about racial stigma. Those are Haitians. Those are not the descendants of American slaves. Those are not people organic to the American political and cultural.
Your theory of race doesn't have to do with country of origin.
I mean, you've essentialized the color of their skin yourself when you assimilate them to the slaves. You've made a gigantic leap. You're saying that the only thing that matters, it's not the language that they're speaking. It's not how they comport themselves. It's not whatever. It's only that their skin is dark. And you've jumped over a century and a half of history to say, aha, aha. And I'm sorry, I don't buy that as a social, psychological, historical explanation, but I'm also very suspicious of the motive of anyone making that leap. They are dealing in a certain kind of currency. There's a certain kind of moral blackmail. There's a sleight of hand that's happening here when you do that. The issue with respect to Haitians at the border is about refugee policy and desperate people who want a better life. It's not about the color of their skin. Black Americans don't have the political capital to spare to lend it to that cause. We can take whatever positions we want to about that cause, but please don't appropriate the 300-year history of my people in this country, on behalf of that cause. That is a bait and switch. It's a trick of optics with respect to politics, and it needs to be disputed. I'm disputing Maxine Waters taking the history of slavery and using it as a trope, as a prop, to argue that we ought to let the Haitians into the country. If she wants to let them into the country, let's discuss that. But let's not say that it was slavery, because it was not. Mm-hmm. I'm not a racial essentialist. Do you see?
No, but I if I understand race is a construct of perception, right? Is that?
Well, yes. I mean, that's not the totality of the things that we have to consider, but yes, because we haven't gotten to this and our time is short. We Black people are situated within the American nation state. We're Americans. Mm-hmm. Nothing happens for us, whether it's police reform or social policy, mm-hmm. that doesn't get processed through the institutions of public deliberation and decision-making, which is the Democratic Republic of the several states of the United States of America. So the fact of racial stigma of Americans needs to be situated within the larger frame of the American project. And I say this in particular with reference to the example we were just discussing about the border. To elide the racial thing with the national thing, where's the boundary of the country? Who are the American people? We can argue about it. The people have different views. But to let it be driven by a superficial assimilation of skin color commonality into a narrative of systemic racism, is going to get your mama. That's what I'm objecting to over here.
I have one final question for you, which is, when you talk about, you've heavily emphasized that you believe that the most important priority is, or the thing that you are now emphasizing is cultural changes that are internal to Black Americans. One of the things that let me put this possible critique to you, and just so you respond finally, is what would you say to someone who says, well, you're being just as impractical because you're asking each individual to try and solve what is ultimately a collective action problem, and that one person, one young man in Chicago say is, are you preaching to that person? Are you saying that there are particular decision points that individual people need to make, or are you saying that a decision needs to be made as an abstract group? What is the practical? I mean, I think your criticisms of the impracticality of just acknowledging systemic racism, we can accept those. But what about the counter criticism, which is, well, okay, but how does one change a culture when each of us are just individuals wandering through the world? And maybe aren't you just shifting the responsibility in a way that doesn't end up actually being able to alter anything?
Okay. So everything is not politics and policies. Some stuff is higher than that. It's about spirituality and it's about sort of fundamental commitment. So I'm not. I don't have an answer to the question. I mean, you're right. I'm going to repair to this opposition that I introduced earlier between the structural and the existential. I'm speaking not from the point of view of a doctor administering a remedy to a condition. I'm not prescribing in that sense. I'm speaking from the point of view of someone. It's hortatory in the literal sense of the word. It's meant to be a kind of prophetic or visionary injunction. I'm sorry for the way that sounds. I apologize in advance for the self-aggrandizement that's implicit in that characterization. I'm saying, let me try to give an analogy. Okay, let me try to give an example. I'm black and I'm proud. Say it loud. I'm black and I'm proud. That was a popular tune by James Brown back in the late 60s, if I'm not mistaken. Black power. Black is beautiful. Negritude. Black is beautiful. We should know our African heritage, Kwanzaa, communal reenactment of whatever, okay? That would be one example. Let me give another example. Religious revival, which has swept through cultures at different times, sometimes with horrible results, of massive inspirational uprising, a movement within the people of this sort of intense quest for the defining of what gives their lives meaning, and so on. That's a different sphere of human activity. It's not instrumental in the policy prescriptive way, but it's nevertheless a part of our human culture. So I'm saying, remember, I'm speaking to everybody, and I want to come back to that, which audience. I'm mainly in my mind speaking to quote unquote my people, by which I mean African American people / the American people. Mm-hmm. I'm speaking to the dual antecedent there. My people, African American people / American people. There's multiple audiences here. And I'm saying the clock is ticking here in the existential sense, in the sense of how we're going to reckon with the realities that are actually confronting us. And I'm saying that politics is only a part of that. And, you said culture, you were not dismissive, but you characterized it in a way that made me feel uncomfortable because it made it feel trivial. I'm talking about raising children. Again, let me give an example. So there was this case in Chicago where police officers shot to death an 11-year-old boy at 1 a.m. in the morning somewhere. Because the kid had a device. The officer thought it was a gun. There wasn't any gun. And of course, it's a horrible, horrible, horrible tragedy. And the policeman well may have behaved peremptorily, he well may have not exercised good judgment, and it might have been affected by the kid's race. I'm not just saying that any of that was not true. What I'm saying was an 11-year-old was on the streets with a device that looked like a gun running from a police officer, an 11-year-old at 1 a.m. Now, can I be allowed to observe that reveals something profoundly problematic about the structure of social supports within which that youngster was embedded? And we can begin to talk about who's responsible there. That would be a long conversation, and about what practically can be done about it. There will be no panaceas. But to avoid noticing that the failure of the structures of social support for that young person is implicated in his death, because I've made a political calculation that red states like that rhetoric better than blue states do, is just not something an intellectual should do. This is George Orwell talking to you.
Well, I mean, what I meant though was more like, as a practical matter, isn't it easier to try and get the police not to shoot people than to change what 11-year-olds do? Or isn't it easier to say, well, you know, did kids in Detroit go to horrible schools and kids in this white suburban Michigan go to great schools, so we're going to give every kid in Detroit tutoring, than to say, these parents in Detroit are raising their kids bad? Isn't that just like shifting the responsibility without practically being able to alter the situation?
I'd love to give little kids in Detroit tutoring, and I'd like to use some of the money that the public school unions are consuming in many places to not particularly distinctive effect to do so. I'd love to see 1,000 flowers blooming in education. By no means do I mean to abandon the discussion about policy to say that policy is not the only thing worth discussing. I don't have to choose between talking about educational policy in Detroit and talking about parents who need to make sure that they turn the television off and that the kids do the homework. And if I'm in a city like New York City, where in the excellent exam schools, Asian American immigrant children, half of whom are qualifying for reduced price or subsidized lunches, are acing a test that a handful of Black kids are performing well on, I don't decide to completely scuttle the testing regime for the selecting of excellent students in order to accommodate the underperformance of the communities of color whose kids are underrepresented in these schools. I can do both things at the same time. I can address myself to the policy needs of tutoring and other such educational innovation, which I wish more fresh air were allowed within that monopolized system to allow that to happen. And also say, if you don't teach your kid how to read their letters, their numbers, their shapes by the time they get to first grade, if you don't make sure that your kid is getting homework brought home, why would I not talk about parenting? Because I think that there are legitimate questions of whether there's enough funds going into the school system. I don't have to choose.
Well, I truly appreciate all the time you've given me. The book is The Anatomy of Racial Inequality from it's out in its second edition from Harvard University Press. And I should also mention that the book is dedicated to your late wife and includes a really heartwarming and moving tribute to her at the beginning, which I feel the need to mention because it's clearly such a it's a really beautiful dedication, and the book itself is incredibly stimulating and provocative, and a really fascinating mixture of sociology and economics that draws from various intellectual traditions to answer some of the hardest questions that I think we can pose about the difference between structure and agency, about what race is, about how we should think about it, about what racism is. So, Professor Glenn Loury, thank you very much for joining me.
Nathan, thank you so much for a penetrating interview and a wonderful intellectual experience. I love that you so closely read and thought about my book. Thank you. And this is the bottom line of the argument that I want to make here today. Race has got something to do with it. I take historical narrative seriously. I take very seriously, what's the story? What's the account? What are we about as a nation? Here's a civic enterprise. 250 million people striving
For what? Who are we? Where are we going? From whence have we come? What's the story? Okay. Now, race, if I've got anything to say about it, is going to be a part of that story.